Good afternoon. My name's Jonathan Norman from the Major Projects Association, and given the growing significance of EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion in major projects, I'm delighted to be interviewing Michael Gates on the subject of working across cultures. So Michael, welcome, and will you start by introducing yourself?
Well, I'm Michael Gates. Before anyone asks, I'm no relation to Bill, which is not quite true because actually my dad was called Bill Gates, and I since discovered that Bill is actually something like my 14th cousin 5 times removed. So it's not quite true anymore. I'm British. I'm based in Helsinki in Finland, where I've been for 34 years. I've been teaching cross-cultural communication negotiation for getting close to 30 years now. And then one of my main clients is the University of Oxford, where I'm an associate fellow and I teach cross-cultural negotiation there. Is that enough for you?
That's perfect. Thank you very much. Michael, when you talk about culture and cross-culture, what are the most obvious cultural facets and behaviors that you expect to see at play in a typical project team?
Well, I talk mainly about national culture. So if you want to position it with diversity and inclusion, my main field is national culture. But there's so many cultures in the world, over 200 countries registered officially. And one way of looking at behavior is to try and categorize it into different types. And the types that I talk about are linear types, multi-active types, and reactive types. What does that mean in a project team? Well, your linear people, they are likely to possibly be Northern European, North American. They tend to do one thing at a time. They're very structured. Engineers are quite often rather linear. Accountants, people in information technology. And they focus on the facts. They're fairly what we call low context. Then you quite often get in teams what I'd call multi-active types. If we think geographically, they may be Southern European, South American. And if you think about projects, they're quite often the people who are either creative or are involved in sales and marketing. And then the reactive types, these are the ones who tend to spend a lot of time listening. And if you think geographically, then they're likely to be East Asian, Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese. Quite often professionally, people who are reactive in an organization have got rather academic backgrounds. They're in research and development. And for them in meetings, it's all about listening and then creating a sense of harmony and consensus. So those would be three types that I would identify to sort of make it simple.
Okay, so if I was putting together a delivery team for a brand new project, how could I kind of map those types or indeed other elements of culture? And what might I consider in order to improve the team and ultimately the chances of project success?
Well, I think mapping is a key word here, because one of the key things to begin with is to understand who you are and the impact that your way of doing things and your way of communicating has on other people. And self-knowledge is not an easy thing. And then once you've mapped that and understood yourself and the others in the team, then it's really important to try and bridge those gaps. I mean, I think many teams, particularly a new team, will jump into the task without thinking too much about the process of communication. And it's absolutely vital. And particularly, I've come across many project teams where the leader has risen to that position through being good in a technical way at the sorts of things they do. So, for example, they might have been a brilliant engineer. And then suddenly, because they've been promoted, they end up in a role where they're having to deal with people. And people who are in different time zones, people who are from different cultures, people with different professional backgrounds. And that can make it extremely challenging for them. And sometimes, in fact, quite often, I've discovered that people who have changed into that more people-centered role, afterwards they say, well, thanks for the promotion, but really, this was too hard. I don't want to do this again. So they need to develop good people skills, invest some time in understanding themselves and the others.
That's quite challenging in a project environment, because a lot of organizations put great emphasis on developing a kind of consistent form of governance and processes that are the same from project to project. And yet, if the project team and if the makeup of the project supply chain is very different and culturally very different, then you're suggesting that actually they should be really adapting to that rather than trying to impose their established best practice, in inverted commas.
Well, I think what I'm mainly talking about is the process of how they communicate. And of course, there may be established procedures for when you communicate and what media you use. However, I'm talking about communication as an interpersonal skill. I'll give you one example. I was working some time ago with a Swedish project team. And well, when I say Swedish, it was a Swedish company. There were many different nationalities in the team, but the team leader was Swedish. And he said, we had this really tricky problem in the team, that the American and the Brit couldn't understand each other. Even though their first language was English, they were talking over each other. And he said, I've worked in both the UK and the US. And so I saw my role as some sort of intermediary or bridge or cultural interpreter. And he gave me an example. He said at a meeting, one of the Brits said, that's an interesting idea, to something that the American had proposed. And after the meeting, the American came to him, the Swedish leader, and said, thank goodness, finally, the Brits seem to be on board. They agree with us. He said, don't think so. He said, what do you mean? He said, well, when a Brit says, interesting idea, it probably means they disagree. So the Swedes said, look, next team meeting, can we just put this on the table and discuss it as a team? Because we've got to improve the way in which we understand each other. Because once understanding breaks down, then that leads to a loss of trust, and that can lead to poor results. He said, okay. And so he explained it to everyone. And he said, what are we going to do about it? And then someone said, I've got a bright idea. In the future, if anyone disagrees really badly with someone else, why don't we all use the phrase, interesting idea? So it added some humor to it. It put communication on the table, and it established some sort of common language for disagreement.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, imagine taking the example of that delivery leader, or indeed members of his or her team. What can an organization and what can managers and what can individuals do to help their colleagues adapt to the challenge of working between and across cultures in a project team or across project organizations?
Well, I think one thing that you can do is think of ways in which you can increase self-awareness and awareness of others. And certainly what I do when I'm working with teams is I put people through an online self-assessment, which we developed some years ago. And this one is based around the model of linear, active, multi-active and reactive cultures. It doesn't have to be that. It could be one of the psychometric tests like Myers-Briggs or whatever. The reason I use this one is, well, first I helped to develop it, and it's a very simple one. It's based on 3 dimensions. And of course, within that, you can have a mix of dimensions. So someone could be a mix of linear and multi-active, or of linear and reactive, for instance. But if you do a self-assessment, of course, that can be biased, because no matter how much you try and validate it, sometimes people may answer how they think they're supposed to answer, or they're really not very self-aware. So the next stage is to get everyone in the team to do a mini assessment on each of your colleagues. And then in a debrief, you can see the gaps between how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you. Because I think quite often, if it goes wrong at an interpersonal level or communication level within a team, it's based on misperceptions. I'll give you an example. I was working with a team recently of many different nationalities, run by a French guy. And when we did the 360, as always, I get the team leader to do the debrief first, and it's done in front of everyone. Everyone has to agree to this process. And I looked at his profile and showed it everyone. And on communication, he came across strongly reactive, which was basically, I listened most of the time. I said, do you want to have a look now at what the team thought about it? You can't see the individuals, but you see the consolidated result. Well, as you might have guessed, the team thought he talked most of the time. And so he said, well, why is this? They said, well, we don't think that you're a good listener because typically when we've got something important to tell you, you're sending texts, reading emails at the same time. You don't give the impression of listening. You said, oh, no, I'm very good at doing many things at the same time, but that's not the impression. So then my role is to say, look, will you commit? Will you promise that you're really going to try in future to show that you're listening? One very simple thing to do. And he said, okay. And then I had another session with him later. He said, well, he's getting a bit better. He's improving. So you've got to do a bit more. You've got to be persistent.
Yes, yes. And I'm guessing, for many international teams, I mean, they may be used to working in a sort of environment in which they're not co-located, but the pandemic and the switch to 100% virtual must have created new stresses, new problems. Are there very specific things to be overcome in that context?
Well, if I go back to the model of culture, then I would say that virtual is of its nature a rather linear format. And I remember speaking to an Australian lady I know who works in Italy, and she said it was fantastic going virtual because the Italians were turning up on time. They weren't being as emotional, and they were a lot more structured. So it's a sort of quite linear transactional medium. I think to begin with, people who are multi-active find that quite a challenge because they miss the casual conversations, the gossip, the personal touch, the water cooler meetings by chance. So, I mean, two things you have to do. One is to sort of engineer serendipity, maybe organize a few meetings which are not work related just to get the atmosphere going. And then as a leader, you have to develop your emotional intelligence because typically in many cultures, leaders do keep a certain distance, not in every culture, not in Sweden, for example, but in many cultures, a sort of hierarchical distance. And suddenly people in their team are plunged into their home and, their dog's barking and the kids are fighting and, all sorts of things are going on around them. They can see what's on their bookshelves, etc. So suddenly they need to be more intimate in a way, even if they're at a distance. And leaders need to develop their emotional intelligence more to see how people are feeling, what's the emotional temperature. Finally, if you think about reactives, they can find it hardest because they're not the sorts who, even in a live meeting, are ones to push themselves forward. And unless you manage the communication well, then they can easily drift to the edges of a meeting. And one final amusing anecdote that I heard recently from a Japanese colleague was that apparently Zoom in Japan had been getting quite a lot of requests from people asking, can we make it so that when we go on Zoom, that the boss's video is at the top of the screen and is bigger? And then the next level in the organization, can they be at the next? So they wanted Zoom to be rather like an organogram. So culture does affect it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's interesting that they felt the need that they wanted to change Zoom rather than to think about how they might change being so hierarchically minded. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, because change is not easy.
No, absolutely. I mean, that brings me to my last question, really, which is, if you're a large organization and you're looking to develop the kind of competencies and the capability over a medium term, so to improve cross-cultural working, what kinds of things would you advocate?
I think you have to first of all realize that this is not something that can change overnight. I had an Indian company contact me last week saying we'd like a 4-hour session, introductory session, and then after that we'd like you to measure how people's behavior has changed. So we can't really do that in 4 hours. We can measure how much they've remembered, what they've learned by giving them some situational questions, but behavioral change, you can't do it overnight or with one session. And I think there's a process where, first of all, you need to raise awareness, then sensitivity, then what I'd call cultural agility, skills that you could adapt yourself to. And then I think the application is very important. So if you build culture into other behavioral skills training, like leadership, teams, team performance, negotiating, have some coaching sessions so that people can go and apply it, then come back and tell you what's happened. Say, well, maybe you could try it this way next time, or get them to come up with it. Then that's really important. But the one thing that you can really work on is your communication. And there was a recent Harvard Business Review report on some research that was done. This was all in the US, but of course, you were talking about individuals, not just national culture. And the researchers analyzed 25 million words of exchanges by email between judges and lawyers. And they found something quite extraordinary. The program analyzed the structure, the syntax, the vocabulary, the tone, and they found that where the language of the lawyers somehow mirrored the language of judges, they had double the chance of winning their case. So I think there's a strong case for adapting communication. The question is, who adapts to whom? I would say, what do you want to achieve, or who has the power in this relationship? That's where you need to adapt. But it does need persistence. By understanding each other better, probably you can increase psychological safety. You need to manage things so that everyone contributes evenly. So if you're the leader and you've got multi-actors in the team, you need to know how to stop them. And then you need to know how to get the reactives to come out of their shell and contribute. It does require persistence.
Yes, yeah. Michael, that's fantastic. Thank you ever so much. Really, really great insights, and you've got me thinking about all sorts of things, really, in terms of assumptions that I have and things that I do. I find that I need to be regularly reminded of this because I tend to revert to stuff. I think we all do, but that's tremendous. Thank you.
Great, thank you.